Thank you. I tell you what, it's so freaky to be sitting on the side here and watching yourself age by about 40 years, you know. And that was, it's kind of setting me off here a little bit. But McKeel, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I am going to talk about this long boom too, but I want to give credit where credit's due. When they first approached me and said, hey, you know, do you want to do this this talk to the New Utopia and revisit the long boom, it really got me thinking. They interviewed me in London in the spring, and Sander was really probing on, hey, wow, rereading that piece and making me think about it. So I actually went to Wired Magazine, the current crew, and I basically pitched them. I said, hey, what if we did another long boom cover story? And they are totally into it. And so come the first of the year here, you're going to see a cover story, a revisited long boom 2. And one of the things is in the reporting, people have suggested I call it the long boom squared, which I'm going to explain a little bit more later here. So it's quite an interesting thing. And I am going to kind of point you towards what I think is a positive and but plausible way possible till 2050. That wouldn't necessarily be utopia, but it could make for a much better world. And so anyhow, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly and kind of give you the frame of what I'm thinking here to think about it. This is the original cover story. Came out in 97, July 97. I co-authored it with Peter Schwartz there. And at the time, there was also a very kind of depressing kind of period in the mid-90s. We forget about this. But people were thinking America was in decline, and everyone's kind of moping around. The boomers were saying, well, we'll never have it as good as our parents did in the post-war boom, all kind of stuff. And Wired, we thought, you know, this is nutty, actually, just thinking about how these new technologies are going to go, the economic growth off of that, and some of the things that will come in the next 25 years. And so we made this story from 1980, told the story of the world from 1980 to 2020. And in fact, the story's largely played out. I mean, if you look at, for example, let me see if I got this here. You know, you look at where 1997 is there. There was just about 250,000 websites. And look what's happened in those 20 years. Boom, you know, we've got almost close to 2 billion of them. Boy, there was growth in the web and on the internet. That's interesting. Well, in July 1997, Apple Computer had just rehired Steve Jobs. They were months away from bankruptcy. And we said, you know what? These companies are going to be big. And in fact, Apple was the first one to get to $1 trillion company, as you know. Not just Apple, on the backs of Apple, they kind of created a platform. Then here's, for example, the growth in app developers off the back of that thing. So it isn't just about a few companies. Amazon was this goofball thing. No one knew what an Amazon was. Look at back down there in 97. And they were selling books, right? And in fact, look at that growth over the last 20 years. And in fact, it isn't just Amazon. They've now got about half the people selling off Amazon and third party. Again, a platform that's actually kind of spreading the wealth in many ways. This is the most valuable companies in the world in 2001, roughly kind of at the end of that decade of the 90s. Basically, the 20th century kind of financial services and oil and you name it, retail and stuff. And this, of course, is just the latest, just coming in September 1st here, all tech companies. So in fact, we did see a crazy long boom. The other thing we had said in the story is like, hey, you know, China's going to rise in a way, and the globalization is going to tie this world together in really spectacular ways. And that was, by the way, Shanghai, which didn't exist when I was a foreign correspondent, as he mentioned, in Asia. Here's the GDP growth of China and the United States over that period. Again, look at the mid-90s there. They were kind of flatlined. And look at how China is now the second most powerful, biggest economy in the world. It wasn't just that. They were pulling, these are the cities, the major cities that were, again, just knucklehead little places in the 90s there. And in fact, look at those trillions of dollars GDP by individual cities there. Again, a long boom that was coming. And yes, even though we talked about it as a tech boom and an economic boom and tried to stay away from a stock boom, if you take the big picture over those 25 years, the Dow has basically gone up 20 times. It is incredible. It was largely right. We called some things wrong. I thought we'd get to the Mars, for example. I thought humans would land on Mars by 2020, but we didn't get everything right. And so when I repitched Wired, I said, you know, what would happen if we basically did this again? And they love this idea because the situation is totally the same as it was then. In fact, it's worse now. People can't even imagine a positive future. People are living in this dystopian kind of sense. Everybody's depressed. No one knows where things are going. Business is confused. Everybody doesn't know what the heck's going on. And so we said, this is the time to write a positive but plausible way forward. What could happen in the next 30 years, in this case, to get us to 2050? They love the idea. It's going to come out soon. I'm in the middle of the reporting now One of the things that's gotten me think about this, and Lanny Cohen here from Capgemini, I want to give kudos here, is we have, for the last 4 years, my company Reinvent and Capgemini have partnered to actually bring together every month a new innovator from a different field to really talk about what's happening in that field and look forward into the future. And so we've been spending really the intellectual elite, you could amend, basically of the Bay Area, Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, have been coming into Capgemini every month, and we've really been discussing the future. It gave me a good start of thinking about this. And my reporting so far has been, I'm going to get about 25 people, and everybody I talk to here, some of the people I've been talking to already, some of them also who have spoken at our things, they are they're very optimistic about the future. They see very huge things happening here that most people seem to be missing. And one of the reasons is so many people really do miss the big picture. They're looking so close at the, this leaf in front of them, the latest tweet from Trump, or the latest, little fluctuation in the stock market. And some people pull back big enough to kind of see, well, there's a bunch of leaves and trying to figure out, but they're still kind of trapped in the forest there. But what I'm going to do here, and what people are trying to do, if you really pull back and look at the big picture, we're living in an extraordinary era, and the decades ahead here actually have so much promise. In fact, more promise, I would argue, than what we had in the 90s actually going forward. Now, the other way to think about it from besides big picture is to think long-term and historically. And so, for example, when you think of the post-war boom, which everybody can kind of knows by heart now, it's like, oh yeah, the war ended, oh, and then America kind of had this boom in the 50s, and, by the way, oh, it kept going, and the free world, Europe got back on its feet, and Japan, and oh yeah, the oil shocks basically kind of put that to an end, but we had a huge boom there. Now, the one way you can tell a story is that's kind of an economic story. You can tell a story with technology. Oh, after the war, we had mainframe computers and atomic energy and commercial aviation and plastics, and play that out for the 40 years. Or you can, talk pure politics. Oh, the New Deal kind of created a situation in the Great Society, and there was a welfare states in Europe, and they kind of had a different way of running the economy. Different ways to tell that. And when we look back today, it's a very clear story. You're not debating the latest things. You're not confused. It's like, boom. And there's kind of a consensus of what's going on. That's what we're trying to actually do with the long boom. We're telling the story from the future, telling an historian looking back on the last long boom, the boom that I just wrote 25 years ago, and we're doing the same thing with this one. Now, if you take that big picture, long-term perspective, there's some things that people really miss here in our kind of hand-wringing of how screwed up the world is. It's actually pretty crazy. I mean, I could spend the whole... If I had a longer talk, I could just bombard you with data here. But if you take prosperity, GDP per capita, you go back, way back, and it's just incredible what's happened even this century, but even since the 80s there, how much the world has just been pushing up. And again, this isn't just in the hands of a few. This is per capita GDP and how people are really living better lives. If you take poverty, most people for all of human history, go back to 1820s, everybody was extremely poor. You go back to the 1980s there, where that green line picks up, we still had about 50% of the planet was in extreme poverty, which is, think of it as $2 a day. And that is now driven down, just in our era here, to actually less than 10% of the planet. And we are on our way to basically eradicating that. You take wars. I mean, we've had horrific wars for all of human history. Look at the battle deaths in World War II there, and then the Vietnam War and that kind of stuff. But look at, there's nobody dying anywhere near the scale of wars that we used to have. This is facts here. This is, by the way, all coming from Steven Pinker, one of the people I interviewed, and has a fantastic book, The New Enlightenment, or Enlightenment now it's called, has unbelievable amount of these trends. Take homicide, closer to home, Now, England, you guys are sane, and you don't have basically a steady homicide rate. But the United States, since the 90s, it's been coming down dramatically, actually. And across the world, if you think of all the places, actually, homicides are down. You take accidents. You can take anything, car accidents, everything else. Look at planes. Planes are getting so safe, you can't get any safer on a plane anymore, right? And again, that's a better progress. You take basic education of the world. Basically, the rest of the world is coming up to Western standards, and people are actually getting, literacy is almost at 90% around the world. Anyhow, boom, progress, particularly since the 1980s, this last 40-year thing. You can take human rights. If you're a gay person, you'd much rather be living someplace in the world today than when it was illegal not too long ago, right? And you can go through everything there. And even democracies, as much as we wring in our hands about authoritarianism, this is the rise of democracies compared to autocracies, or essentially authoritarian regimes. And again, since the 80s, after the end of the Cold War, that spiked up, and that has not substantially dropped yet, although we've had some issues. So anyhow, a lot of progress going on here. That's a big deal. Now, if you take the long boom, the last long boom, a little closer to home, instead of that post-war boom, there is an interesting story, and you can tell it a little clearer now, because we just came through it, but it's still it's still not locked in history yet. But you can tell from a technology point of view. Oh yeah, in the 80s we introduced these PCs, the IBM PC, I remember that. And oh yeah, the 90s was all about this internet thing. That was crazy, wasn't that interesting? Oh, and then we all went mobile in the early 2000s. And by the end of that run, you had these tech titans running the world, right? And everyone's pissed off at them. You can tell with technology, you can tell it from economics. You can say, the world opened up after the Cold War, and China went from communism to capitalism, and Russia came on, and we had this huge boom in Brazil, and Turkey, and everybody else was booming, and wow, we had this crazy economic boom. You can tell in politics. In 80, Ronald Reagan came to power, and Margaret Thatcher, and they shifted the politics more conservative in the kind of countries, and we had a more entrepreneurial, pro-business environment. Boom, boom, boom. You can tell that story, and that is essentially the story we're telling here. If you really look back on it, we essentially have been through a 40-year run of much more entrepreneurial, pro-business, conservative political era. I think that's coming to an end. Just like you can look back and say the same thing from the post-war world, that was a more progressive era, New Deal, welfare state, kind of different kind of economy, the way Carlotta was talking about it. And that's the kind of that. Now, the long boom squared, it's much harder to look forward. But you can actually start to see a story forming here, and this is what I'm going to write basically in this cover story thing here. And so if you kind of go out for the next 40 years, for the lack of a better term, if you talk the digital global era we just went through, I would call this the sustainable era. And one of the things you're going to see, you can tell with technology. Wow, we're going to watch AI kind of go everywhere. We'll get back to that in a second. It's going to be an incredible shift to new energies, basically, particularly driven by climate change. Oh my gosh, we've now cracked the genetic code. We can now engineer humans as well as all plants. There's going to be a whole biological revolution, and ultimately you can maybe get us back to state. Maybe we'll get to Mars in this basically next cycle here. Anyway, you can tell a technology story, you can tell an economic story, you can tell a political story. And again, the specifics are harder to talk about, but I would argue, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the remaining time here, I think we're heading into a much more sustainable technology thing is going to be a big definer, more egalitarian economics, rebalancing the kind of economy, and I think it's going to be more progressive politics generally. And I think it shows the kind of yin-yang of how the world kind of works like this. I think it's, and for business people to think about this, I think you really got to wrap your head around this and just kind of share that with Perez and others who have been talking about that. Now, so from that perspective of someone in 2100, that's when I'm going to write this story for Wired coming up. Now, people have been talking about AI, and I do think it's worth kind of jumping on this fast here and giving my 2 little cents here. Because not in the technical way, we've seen some great technical explanation yesterday. But think this one through. I think this is a pretty crazy thing. First of all, AI isn't going to dominate us anytime soon. I mean, we've had, again, in the Bay Area, we've had a bunch of AI events here through Lanny and Capgemini. In fact, we got a great one next week with Gary Marcus. The really people know that. They're just saying that's just not happening. Don't even worry about that kind of stuff. It's much more now about augmenting human beings. How are they going to essentially extend our capabilities? And so there's 2 key things to think about this. We have this insanely big data issue here, and there's many ways to talk about that. But since everything went digital in that kind of last 20 years we've watched incredible how data is piling up. And it's just worth pointing out that our data now, all digital, is piling up every 2 years, doubling it every 2 years. So we're getting an insane amount of data. We're also watching everybody around the world. This is how many people were on the internet just at 2000 by region of the world. That's how much by region of the world 2010. That's 2018, the latest numbers. We got a little ways to go. But think about this. You're going to have everything digitized and datatized, and you're going to have everyone connected with these supercomputers. That is where AI steps in. Because the only things that can deal with that kind of level of magnitude of data and magnitude of connection is essentially going to be AI. And I would say what we're watching with deep learning is the beginnings of that. It's going to go through every field. You're going to see 10,000 new startups in this space. You're going to watch it go through every organization, just like everyone had to get on the web and everyone had to do that mobile. It's going to be with AI. We're going to watch a crazy thing, and eventually, by the end of this kind of era, it'll be like electricity. We won't even think about it. everybody will basically have AI-enabled everything. The other thing which I think people are underestimating is the simultaneous language translation, which Google has just cracked. We saw it from a previous speaker, as well as any human now. Think about this. When everyone connecting to the planet can actually talk in real time in all languages, and you can search everything across all languages, which, by the way, there's a company called Omnity right now that's doing that right now. That's a big deal. That is a stimulus to innovation like no one has ever thought about before. And so that's the other thing I would just point out to us here is in the last 40 years, we figured out how to innovate and innovate fast and systematize it through design thinking, fast, lean startups, iterative kind of, all the different things you guys basically do through tech. That is a system now, and everybody gets it, and it's taught from school or the minute you're in college. Think of how that spurs innovation in this long broom squared. AI-enabled people connected all over the world across languages with methodologies to innovate fast and scale. It's a crazy amount of things we're heading into. And so I think what we're kind of on the verge of here is a fundamental rethink. First thing of design thinking is you got to put a goal. You got to put, what are we going for? None of you do a project without putting the goal out there first. Our politics now, we don't have a goal. Our economics right now, we don't have a goal. We're going to get a goal. It's going to come fast here. And then the switches are going to start flipping. And when these switches flip, things are going to move fast. Now, one switch that's flipping is climate, and I'm just moving very fast here. But the one graph that we don't want to go up is the heat of the planet, which is this one. It's unambiguous now that we are in this. We're watching now the implications. This is Houston. Oops, that was Houston. Flooded in their last big hurricane in a way that had never happened before, 100-year flood, or 500-year flood, I think it was. Hurricane. Anyhow, the point I think is driven home, finally in the United States, where it's not kind of a question of what's going to happen. And the other thing is the technology is hitting, so just like in the early web, we were saying, hey, this thing's going to happen, folks. This is what you can start to see now with solar energy, just to take one example. This, is how the prices of solar energy have come down since the same 80s, this 40-year thing, to the point where it used to be $76 a watt, now it's 74 cents a watt. That was actually about 5 years ago. You're watching that same thing happening. You're watching essentially, here's the cost of solar compared to all the other kind of energy sources, including coal. It's getting cheaper, certainly in some parts of the country, cheaper. It's totally scalable. China's scaling it. Boom. You can imagine this the same way we saw the kind of web take off. And you are starting to watch the numbers of solar just go through the roof. And you're starting to watch renewables. This is global renewable energy. Still only about 10%, but it is on the right direction, and it could move fast. Long way to go. Second thing is this electric car revolution. I can give you all these examples in the story. We'll do this. Look at the cost of batteries coming down here. That, again, is just in this decade. We're watching batteries plunge. That orange line is the cost of lithium-ion batteries, which is key to the cars. That green is what the cost, essentially parity would be with the internal combustion engine. And those are other kind of takeoff points by different groups starting to say, once that hits parity, which you're saying is 20 this year and next year, you're going to watch the ramp up coming. You're already starting to see that ramp up here in the United States. Once Tesla cracked the model, the legacy companies started moving. You're watching all these things moving. Again, think early 90s. Think what happened in 25 years. That's what we're doing. The switch is flipped, I would say. The other thing about it is we have now cracked the human genome. First human genome cost $2 billion. We had Lindy Avey from 23andMe the other day in our event. $2 billion cracked first human genome. Now they're about $500, right? And eventually they'll be $25, right? Everybody on the planet will have their human genome, basically. We also now, with CRISPR, have figured out how to genetically engineer things, create life, monkey around with the code of life. That is crazy big deal. And in fact, we're watching all this speculation of what happens for human medicine. I would say from a sustainability point of view, we're watching how it's going to affect food, growing meat, how we're going to do materials differently. And just one example of this, you take another petrochemical thing from the oil, and that's the growth of global plastics in our era, to the point where we saw that flood, that stream filled with bottles the other day, what that actually did. I think we're going to see a whole thing where we'll essentially engineer materials that'll be biodegradable and in ways that we're going to actually see much more sustainable ways forward. Again, another switch being flipped. And to go back to the generational thing which we started here, The other switch is flipping is a power shift between generations. And this is the millennials, who, if this is right now the population of the United States by generation. And if you really go into the guts of the economy, you could kind of say there, which is your buyers and your workers. That's what it is now. And the boomers that are still kind of controlling politics, they're going stage right. And I'm one of those boomers. And you can see where the solid is essentially going down too. Gen X, millennials. Millennials are fully in the guts of the thing. And look at Gen Z there. But here, push it out. 30 years out, essentially Gen Z and millennials are going to be the game. Baby boomers will be pretty much all retired and off in their different world. 2040, that's the game. It's all about millennials and Gen Z, and we don't exactly know what the generations afterwards. And this is, by the way, US Census data. And ultimately, 2050, that's the world we're going to be living in, right? So what the millennials and the Gen Z want to do is what's going to define the next era, and it's already starting in politics. And I don't have a ton, and I think I would say this election, even the 2018 was the first election where actually they included Gen X and the millennials and those younger outvoted, where more people voted than the boomers and the silent. And it's only going to go up. That switch is flipping. So let's come to politics. And I know it's a business audience, we don't have a lot of time here, so I'm not really going to get into politics, but I would say this has political implications. I think Carlotta was really at an interesting frame, which I share. I think we're going to watch a big shift in politics. I would say for those that are just want to get ahead of the game a little bit, my own advice is to really think about what's been happening in California in the last decade here, which has kind of been roughing out a different kind of politics. This is the current governor, and I interviewed him actually for our What's Now. I've had him a couple times in. I also wrote a big series in Medium called California's the Future. It was commissioned by Medium, which lays out the political implications of this. I do think what's happened in California is going to come more to the United States, for better or worse, depending on your politics. But it's worth, as a business, starting to think that is essentially something to be planning for a little bit more. And I do think we're going to watch all kinds of things happening. Transportation is going to go electric. We're going to rebuild cities. This sharing economy, I think, is going to happen more. We're going to watch a different kind of food revolution, sustainable living, AIs through everything. We're going to see robotics all over the place. We're going to see genetics and biotech and all this stuff I said. There's a whole new set of decisions that are going to be made in politics. What are the ethics around genetic engineering, that kind of stuff. That is going to make a huge, huge difference going forward. I think the early warnings, you're starting to see the early discussions about this. Again, keep an eye on what's happening in California right now, which is, again, fifth largest economy in the world, 40 million people, often prefigures what happens in the United States. So it's an interesting petri dish to watch what's happening. And the final little thoughts here, if you really want to get big picture, which I like to do, we talked about this view from 2100, what people will think. And I think if they look at the entire constellation of our last through kind of revolutions of technology and economic and political revolutions, you could kind of say, I think they're going to basically look back and see it as an extraordinary, almost like a step change. The whole world went digital. The whole world went global, organized on a planetary scale. The whole world went sustainable. Those are kind of step changes in what is essentially human beings have done up to now. And I think it'll really be thought of essentially, even as early as 2100, as a kind of almost a civilizational change. And if you think of it that way, the last time we went through a civilizational change at a fundamental level was essentially the Enlightenment. We just call it the Enlightenment. Everyone just knows, oh, the Enlightenment. That's Isaac Newton, discovered gravity, invented calculus. And funny enough, people don't realize this, he was recruited to become the master of the mint by the Brits to figure out the foundation of financial capitalism, which was a reliable currency. And they figured out a way to actually get a coinage in such a way that no one could chew off the edges and cheat and dilute the kind of metal and stuff. And so they took the smartest guy in the country and says, figure out the foundation of financial capitalism, which in fact is what we still do today. And by the end of that era there, the Americans were playing in the game, and we literally invented a new way of government, a fundamental representative democracy. And so when we think back on the Enlightenment, from about 1660 to kind of 1780, think of it that way, This was a European mostly thing, although by the end, Americans were at least innovating in the kind of level of representative government. But we invented carbon energies. We figured out, oh, we can dig this stuff up out of the ground, and it actually can, fire stuff up. We invented steam engines and industrial production. We invented factories. We invented financial capitalism, like I say, stable currencies and trade and things like that. We invented representative democracy. These were foundational innovations that essentially our world to this day is still running on. That's our operating system. And by the 1820s, that same kind of distance from that, the 19th century people understood that. We're in a new game here, and they scaled up through the 19th century, and now the 20th century, we've had about a 250-year run on this thing. That's what I think people in the future, this is the Star Trek world of San Francisco's bridge still there, I do think they're going to look back in a similar way on what the era we're moving into here. And I think we're going to watch, they're going to see, hey, we went from carbon energies to clean energies. We went from industrial revolution to a biological revolution. We went from financial capitalism to sustainable capitalism, sustainable both in imbalances between spreading wealth and also in the externalities for the economy. We went from representative democracy to some kind of digital democracy like Carl was talking about, and I think that's what they're going to do. And because of that, I think instead of the long boom 2, we should really be calling this not the Enlightenment, but the transformation. And with that, I'm going to say, there you go. Think about that for the day.